Thank you very much, Mark. And let me welcome our second speaker, Hilde Heynen. Hilde is a professor of architectural theory at the University of Leuven. Her research focuses on issues of modernity, modernism, and gender in architecture and urbanism. She's the author of many books, including Architecture and Modernity, a Critique, Back to Utopia, the Challenges of the Modern Movement, Negotiating Domesticity, or the recent study on Sibyl Moholy-Nagy, Architecture, Modernism, and its Discontents. Sibyl, welcome. Hilde, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So good afternoon, and thank you, Jana, for setting up this interesting conference. Like some previous speakers, my topic is slightly divergent from what I promised in the original title. But unlike the previous speakers, I will not have a very focused talk. I will rather paint some very, very broad brushstrokes, with very broad brushstrokes, a kind of overall recent history of architectural theory. And that is because a couple of weeks ago, this book came out that some of you have bought, apparently. Thank you for that, really nice. Lucia Perez Moreno took the initiative a couple of years ago when she was spending a visiting professorship at my university. And she wanted to translate part of my work in Spanish. And to that end, we put together a table of contents and a book and blah, blah, blah. We didn't yet find the funds for translating that, but since we had a table of contents and since the book was largely there, we decided to try to publish it in English, and so the result is here. Because of this book and my conversations with Lucia, I was kind of forced to look back at my own work and the trajectory that I have gone through, and hence this became the topic of my afterword in this book, looking back, this kind of intellectual autobiography, if you want. And I entitled it The Displacement of Criticality. And it's indeed about how Frankfurt School legacy kind of reformed and displaced itself, at least in my intellectual work, and in the way that I experienced the intellectual landscape of architectural theory. So I will start by reminding you of a kind of the definition of critical theory, talking about the theory moment of the 90s and the post-criticality debate, and what I call the afterlife of theory, to end with new materialisms and neo-Marxism. So critical theory, I think it's important for me to remind us, and of course implicitly it was there in all the talks of this morning, that critical theory, as defined by Max Horkheimer, is motivated by the tension between rationality and reality. Why is reality as it is, and why is it not any better or any more just than it is right now? So looking for the reasons of why society and social reality are what they are, and trying to imagine how it could be different. Not accepting social reality as it is, but always questioning its legitimation, its justifications. Are there possibilities to imagine and realize a more humane, a more just, a more emancipated society? That's always the bottom line of critical theory as understood by Horkheimer, Adorno, and these other guys. And I think that bottom line is, for me, the driving force also behind my work, that for them it was definitely neo-Marxist, but also, of course, motivated by the works of Sigmund Freud and others. And maybe that neo-Marxist legacy kind of deviated a bit in the years after. But my early getting to know critical theory and trying to think architecture and architectural history and architectural theory through the lens of critical theory, of course, is very much indebted to Tafuri, but even more in my case to Michael Müller, because I must admit I understood Michael Müller much better than I understood Tafuri. It has taken me quite a long time to make sense of this book, whereas Michael Müller really helped me grasping, especially Walter Adorno. What do I say? Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno. Walter Adorno, okay. That's a neologism. This was, I think, the processing of critical theory in the field of architecture, and my own book tried to imagine indeed how architecture could be critical. I think that was what really drove us. So we were not as, or many of the theorists of my generation, I would argue, were not as disenchanted as Manfredo Tafuri, as we heard this morning, that architects are necessarily on the side of capitalists and of power. So I think in the 1990s we were looking for, in order to conceive of architecture as something that could be critical. And for the Architecture and Modernity book, I started from the understanding of modernity as based on criticality, as developed by Marshall Berman, confronting it with the condition of metaphysical homelessness as described by Heidegger, and trying to seek a way in between, at the same time keeping on this notion of criticality and modernity, and at the same time somehow taking into account what it means to dwell and what it means to this metaphysical homelessness and so on. So that was, I think, what was at stake in that book in the 1990s. And apparently it was very much a part of what afterwards has been called the theory moment for architecture. The theory moment of architecture, for many embodied by the journal Assemblage, critical journal of architecture and design culture, with the editor-in-chief as Michael Hayes. But at the same time, of course, a critical theory became, with capital letters, became critical theory without the capitals, because it kind of became a much broader term, not only referring to neo-Marxism and Frankfurt School theory, but also including post-structuralism, feminist theories, post-colonial theories. So generally, critical theory has become understood to be a much wider net that was being cast. And as I said, in the 1990s, this idea of critical architecture and how architecture could be critical was very much on the mind of several people. A seminal reference in this respect is, of course, Michael Hayes' article about Mies van der Rohe, which he called critical because he said it was resistant and oppositional. Resistant against dominant societal forces, oppositional towards formalism. I think Michael Hayes has developed quite astute reasoning to make that point. I always had difficulties accepting that Mies, who was so close to corporate modernism, could really be called critical, but that's how Michael Hayes constructed criticality. And then part of the moment of the theory moment is, of course, the Prague-La Villette of Tschumi, the anthologies of the 1990s about theories in architecture, architectural theory since 1968. The 1990s were really great for the field of architectural theory, in that also a major commission in France, like Prague-La Villette, was won by an architect who really based his credentials on theory, on deconstruction and so on, and so that was seen or experienced as really the moment that theory kind of became a defining feature of architectural culture. That moment didn't last very long, because then fast forward a couple of years and we entered the post-criticality debate. in architecture, as most of you will know, started by an often cited article by Bob Somol and Sarah Whiting, Notes around the Doppler effect. I'm not going to explain the Doppler effect, that's far too difficult for me. But the article argues that architecture should not be so much critical because, and they took their clue from Rem Koolhaas, there is something very uncritical about architecture. Architecture in itself, if you build, it's a positive gesture, it can never be negative and critical. So they said, well, architecture doesn't need to be critical, architecture needs to be projective. And architecture cannot escape societal determination, but maybe we can surf the waves. Another metaphor of Rem Koolhaas, that by, on the one hand, obeying societal forces, you nevertheless might twist it, might subvert it, apply some situationist techniques or something, and do something that is not really in your brief, and that might be, so yeah, that's projective architecture. You use the, or as I understood it, you use the features of architecture, the autonomous, if you want, features of architecture and design to do something more than what is asked from you. Index to diagram, dialectics to Doppler. Well, I invite you to read the article and try understanding it. I had trouble, but yeah, these are the key words. Now, they built upon a broader intellectual movement, tendency that was not just there in architecture, but all over the humanities, and for which Bruno Latour was a key reference. Bruno Latour, I have to remind you, also in the 1990s, but then he was not so much cited in architecture yet, had this book, We Have Never Been Modern, arguing that in fact, if modernity, as Habermas would have it, for example, is really based on the separation between the different domains of science, morality, and art, that is what modernity wants, to push these different domains in their own autonomy, and they are seen as different. Latour argues that this is, may I use the word? He argues that this is bullshit. Science, morality, and art have never been apart and are not apart for modern people either. So because their separation is illusory. Reality is much more complex and interactive, consisting of hybrid constellations of humans and non-human, science and politics. You cannot separate all these different things. Hence, the saying that we have never been modern. But also, and that's the reason for the post-criticality discussion, critical reason does not suffice to address the concerns of today. That's the gist of his article of 2004, Critique is Running Out of Steam, it's called. Critical reason is not the best instrument, so critical theory, critical reason, not the best instrument to address the concerns of our time. We cannot univocally decide on matters of fact, and that was because what's still ongoing, but slightly in other terms now. Climate change, for example, for scientists, it was a fact already in the early 2000s, whereas still many people were saying it's a hoax, it doesn't exist, etc. So is climate change a matter of fact? Well, he says if we cannot agree that it's a matter of fact, we should at least agree that climate change is a matter of concern. So what I'm going to argue, that's Latour, is that the critical mind, if it is to renew itself and be relevant again, is to be found in the cultivation of a stubborn, what he calls a stubbornly realist attitude. A realist dealing with what I will call matters of concern. So we shift from matters of fact to matters of concern, where things are seen as not clearly identifiable objects or separate entities, but things are seen as gatherings of multiple actors of domains, as nodes in a network, etc. And he talks about multiplication rather than subtraction. So reality is so entangled, all entities, human and non-human, are actors in a very complicated web of interrelationships, and hence we have to approach reality in this way, talking about matters of concern. So he gave a big push to this post-criticality debate. In architecture, there have been several objections to the post-criticality condition. From Reinhold Martin, I myself contributed to this discussion. Penelope Dean has done that, Isabelle Doucet, Kenny Coopers. I think all people listed here who have, let's say, more adherence to neo-Marxist than Somol and Whiting had. And I think especially Penelope Dean's criticism, which comes much later, which was not part of the debate in the early 2000s, which comes much later, but says, well, I think she really makes a good point, that all this talk about post-criticality really was a kind of disguise, or not even maybe a disguise, but a kind of alibi to go ahead serving the forces of neoliberalism. That's her criticism, rightfully so. Okay, so at a certain point it looked as if theory was over and done with. We are no longer critical, we are no longer theoretical in architecture. It's other issues that now come to the fore. Since my chair in Leuven, I always called it the chair of architectural theory, I felt like existentially threatened by that idea that theory was over. So for me, it was not obvious at all that theory would be over. I felt I could continue pursuing my intellectual interests, and there was continued to be a wealth of interesting ideas out there that we could build upon, etc. And of course, feminism, queer studies, post-colonial studies, they all also got a boost in the 1990s, but the processing, the digesting of these things in architecture really was really going on in the 1990s for feminism, but maybe it slowed down a little bit early 2000s. Queer studies certainly was a little bit later to take off, and then post-colonial studies, of course, completely. For me, these are also versions of critical theory in architecture. So I did not really buy into that end of theory paradigm. And in 2012, I was part of the editorial team putting together this handbook of architectural theory, and we had no trouble at all. Well, we did have trouble. But we managed to get 40 very interesting authors and chapters. Our main trouble was that we also wanted to have voices of people working in non-Western academic context, and that proved to be impossible. That was our trouble. But the book is there, and the neo-Marxist tradition, I think, is interwoven into several of its chapters, although we did not, to be honest, really devote a separate section to it or something, but in between the lines, it's still there. But what for the three of us was very important was the drive to make architecture matter. So maybe it was not really in terms of making architecture critical, or we did not use that term, but at least see how you can, on the one hand, interpret and analyze social reality through the lens of architecture, and on the other hand, think about possibilities for architecture to change and improve social reality, although that sounds very utopian, but I think that was our drive in putting together that book. And now most recently, I think the last decade or so, we have in in the broader field of theory, we have what people seem to call new materialism. I still have to read much more to understand very well what this is all about. But I take my clues from Fox and Aldred, who say, yeah, there is a kind of theoretical and practical turn to matter in many different fields. And the materialities that are taken into account include human bodies, but also other organisms, material things, spaces, places, the natural and built environment, material forces, you name it. This new materialism is often post-humanist and post-anthropocentric, and this brings it a far distance away from the original Frankfurt School critical theory, I think. But for me, it builds on a similar type of drive. They distinguish between several tendencies within new materialism, one building on Deleuze and Guattari, one on Karen Barrett, one on Rosi Braidotti, one on Latour. But they indeed state that what this new materialism is doing is supplying a critical and radical stance to underpin struggles for social justice and plurality. So here I am. I see that you are skeptic. Okay, I'm just quoting. Of course, there is also debate there, and I think for me now, the issue at hand today for me is to figure out how new materialism and then neo-Marxism, or historical materialism, if you want, how they intertwine and or how they interrelate. Because we have quite some debates, rightfully so. For example, Albina Janeva is talking about 5 ways to make architecture political. She does that from an end perspective, building on the works of Latour and others in the end network. Actor network theories, that is, and so she is supposedly practicing this new materialism, but it's very strange to read this book because for me there was not much political about it. Not political in the sense of how do we shape society. This kind of political questions was not there at all. So I find it an odd book. But I'm not the only one formulating this kind of criticism. It's also Douglas Spencer, Peggy Deemer, and others are formulating the same uneasiness with this new materialism as embodied in a scholar like Albina Janeva. So is this new material also post-political? How to think of the relationship between new materialism and historic materialism? For me, that is a challenge for today, but even more for today and for the foreseeable future. I am inspired by books like these, Critical Care, Architecture and Urbanism for a Broken Planet, or this one, The Carrier-Back Theory of Architecture by Rakan Goktas. These are books that associate architecture or make the link between a kind of ecofeminist stance or an ethics of care stance, if you want, which is critical not only of capitalism in the sense of producing division of labor and producing poverty, etc., but also as producing a disaster in terms of ecology and everything relating to the inhabitability of the planet. So critical care indeed is needed according to Fitz and Krasny, and I think in building further on neo-Marxist Frankfurt School, the questions to be asked today about the potential criticality of architecture, if architecture can be critical, it still is an open question, but I lean towards the idea of criticality. Then you can indeed say, if we have to think about architecture in in order to address this type of crisis, we need to think of architecture not as an object, and this is another crisis of the object, if you want, not in terms of buildings that are to be newly built, but we need to think of architecture as how to change, refurbish, transform existing buildings rather than build new buildings. So that, I think, is seeing architecture in a different way, in a feminist way, but for me it has everything to do with this tradition of neo-Marxism, or at least in my personal endeavor, my personal trajectory, there is a direct continuity from my initial engagement with Adorno, Benjamin, and you name them. You forgot Mark Bloch. Bloch did write about architecture. With them and to the present day, where I am exploring more this type of theory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hilde. And